Hi everybody, as you can see I have my CZ97B in front of us, all disassembled from the previous video. I kind of took all the parts and I grouped them all together so that way we can step by step go over the reassembly and hopefully it'll be a little bit easier. But let's go ahead and make a little space. We'll go ahead and tackle one of the more difficult parts of the firearm, which is going to be the Sear cage assembly. So what you'll have here is the Sear cage, the Sear itself, firing pin block lifter, and its respective spring, the L spring, Sear spring, and the retaining pin. So let's take the Sear cage. It's going to be the Sear itself. Go from underneath the cage, come up and over, and we're just going to hold that Sear in place with the retaining pin. You have the Sear spring itself, the long side and short side. Long side is actually going to be set into this cavity. The shorter side is going to be resting against the Sear itself, giving it its pressure. So what I'll do is I'll just set the spring in place, and I can usually just do this with my hands. I'll put pressure down onto the spring, and at the same time I'll be pushing the pin from right to left. So as you can see, I push down on the spring and push the pin through. From the other side, I'm going to push the pin out and leave a gap right here, and that gap is where your firing pin block lifter is going to be. So we'll go ahead and put that in with the hook facing the rear, down through the underside, and I'll line up the hole and push the pin this time from left to right once I get that lined up. So you'll see the pin come through. Again, I'm going to create a gap right there. That's where the L spring is going to be set. Now from the factory, there's a small amount of lubricant that sits in between there, a little bit of grease. It also aids in setting the spring in. As you can see, this spring is very small, very delicate, very easy to lose, so you definitely want to be careful when setting that in. Be mindful of your workspace should it go flying out on you, but you're just going to want to set it into that groove and use a similar technique where once you have it set, you're going to put a small amount of pressure on it to have it go down in. And into place. And as you can see, it's not the easiest thing to handle because it is very small, but just be patient with it. Don't send it flying, and you'll see it right there through the hole. And all you need to do is give it enough pressure so that it'll overcome the pin. So I'm just going to keep working it in, being patient, making sure that I don't send this little spring flying. No, actually, now that I can grab onto it, I'll just take this little micro flathead and I'll kind of work it down. To where it needs to be. So as you can see, once I worked it all in, pretty easy, no big fuss. The pin is flush on both sides. I'll double check the spring tension. So, Sear spring seems to be set in place fine. Sear's coming back. Firing pin block lifter is under tension and also retracts under tension. So everything seems to be set fine. And again, mine seems to be a little bit rough, but that's where that grease from the factory will come in and help smooth that out, which I highly recommend putting a little bit of oil or grease in there. Put that aside for now, and we'll move on to the frame real quick. If you remember from the disassembly video, I actually left the trigger bar spring, which is that one right there with the hook, hooks underneath and comes to the other side, and I also left the magazine release spring in here, which is fine. Magazine release only goes in one way, it's not ambidextrous. Once you have that in, you can push this magazine spring down with your hands, set it into the grooves, make sure that the spring comes down and underneath the trigger bar spring. It's all going to be held in with this retaining screw, which on some of your firearms might have been staked. You might need to have replaced this. Mine was not on this particular firearm, so I'll just go ahead and use the same one and screw it down. And hopefully you remembered where that was tightened down. That's just about where it was tightened down from the factory. So I'll just go ahead and check the magazine release tension, which seems to be working fine. Which brings us to the trigger. Now, from what I understand, there's only about a couple ways to do this, but I'm going to go ahead and use what's called a slave pin. Slave pin is going to be the exact same size as the pin that holds the trigger to the trigger bar. Shouldn't need any hammer of sort. Just line up the holes and push that flush to the other side. You have your trigger return spring, two sides of that, your longer side and your short side. Longer side is going to go up and over, where the short side is actually going to go into the trigger. Using a similar technique to the Sear cage assembly, you're going to take your pin, line it up, push down on the trigger return spring so that it lines up with the pin, and you can push it through to the other side. It's nice and flush. Bringing back the frame, put the trigger bar in the back end first and underneath the inserts, and slide the trigger through the trigger hole. Well, you're going to need something to brace your pistol. This is what I use. Some of you guys might have something a little more sophisticated than that, but it seems to work fine for me. You're going to take your trigger pin, line up your trigger so that that long part of the trigger that was sticking out is now set into its groove. Gonna check to make sure your trigger bar spring is set into the trigger bar and underneath it, which it is. And since I have the slave pin in there, it's holding the assembly all together. All I have to do is get the hole to match up, put the trigger pin in, and push it through. See that the slave pin fell out, which means that I can go ahead and take my pin punch and put the trigger pin all the way through to the other side of the frame. Now, I do recommend using a red Loctite if this trigger pin seems to be loose and you can't get it to tension fit, which in this case it seems like it will not be able to tension fit, so I would highly recommend using a red Loctite on probably both sides, so that way through normal use this trigger pin doesn't work its way out. That'll bring us to putting in the hammer, but before you do that you're going to need to put in your safety detent. That's your safety detent with the spring. You're going to put that into the groove right in here, and the teeth will be hanging in its appropriate position right there. So once it's set in place, you'll be able to visually see it through the hole. We'll make sure that the teeth are set into that groove, which they are, and the spring is to the rear of the frame. You have a small pin. Whoa. Which I just almost lost. We'll have a small pin that goes into the frame right there, which will come out through here. But you don't quite need to put it in yet because you're going to need to put your hammer retaining pin in. But I just like to set it in place first. So that way I have it ready. Take your hammer strut, hammer, connect it to your disconnector, put it through the slot, and put the disconnector over the trigger bar. Line up your hole. Your hammer retaining pin can only go through the left side of the frame to the right, and then you'll push down on that small pin and have it come down, so that way that doesn't fall out. Well, before we put in the Sear cage assembly, just go ahead and double check all the springs, make sure that everything is in place where it needs to be. Seems like everything's doing just fine. Going to take the Sear cage assembly, the disconnector in place. Make sure that it is placed to the rear of the frame, just like so, and that it mates up with the safety hole, and your safety D10 is still poking through. Now take your manual safety, push it through till it will come to a stop. It'll come in contact with your Sear spring, should be right here. Take your little micro flathead screwdriver while you're pushing your manual safety in. Until it hits another stopping point. That'll be the manual safety detent right there, where you'll take your micro flathead screwdriver, put tension on the teeth, and that will allow you to push your manual safety to its final position. You'll secure the safety with the Sear spring once you set it back into the groove. You pull the hammer back, check that the safety works, which it does. Again, double checking that all your springs are in place, which they seem to be doing fine. Go ahead and put some tension on the hammer here, and move these out of the way. Use hard flat surface. Get the hammer plug. Make sure that this is facing the forward position. Push down. And push the pin through. Now take your magazine brake, work it down into those grooves that you have facing forward. Take the appropriate pin. Shouldn't need a hammer here again. Just push it through to the other side of the frame. Flush. Everything should be flush. Check, see that everything is still functioning. I wouldn't allow the hammer to go back onto the components inside here. Puts a lot of stress on those components, so just manually lower the hammer as you're checking the tension of the springs. Which, again, everything seems to be working just fine. So we'll work our way up to the slide. So you can see I left the loaded chamber indicator in place, as well as the extractor. Never had an extracting issue with the CZ, any of my CZ, so I've never found necessary to take one out, but it's held in with a pin. As you can see, from the top of the slide down to the bottom of the slide, there'll be an appropriate spring inside, as well as the extractor piece. Loaded chamber indicator will be held in with the Allen screw on top. Take your firing pin block. It can only be set in on this particular model one way. Make sure that that goes down. You have your firing pin with the firing pin spring. You'll see these grooves on the firing pin, which will be needed to be positioned in the 12 o'clock position. Since my slide's upside down, I'm going to go ahead and put that upside down as well. So now it's in the 6 o'clock position. Before you've put the firing pin in, you want to make sure that the cavity inside is clean and free of any debris. But you also could put a small amount of lubricant into the cavity. Don't recommend using oil, as it might seep through the hole, but a tiny film of grease would definitely not hurt it. So activate or deactivate the firing pin block. Push the firing pin in as far as it'll go. Let the firing pin block go, and the firing pin will be held in place by the firing pin block. If you might have seen in the disassembly video, this is the original retaining pin, and it's been chewed away quite a bit, as you can see, from normal use and dry firing. So I recommend, and I replace these on all of my CZs with an upgraded part from Cajun Gunworks, which allows me to dry fire all I want. But let's see, if you're installing an OEM part or actually an aftermarket part, they should all have this little slit up on top. Again, that's going to be positioned in the 12 o'clock position. Go ahead and put that through. We'll just go ahead and pretend that this is a 100% functioning piece. We'll start it out by punching it about halfway. Going to need to depress. You're going to have to press the firing pin in flush and punch the rest of the retaining pin in, and then that way it'll hold it in that position. Now, before I put the rest of that retaining pin in, I just want to double check the function. So the firing pin block works, moves freely. Your firing pin will move freely as well, but it'll be stopped by the firing pin block. So if I press the firing pin block and press the firing pin, it should come out, and you can see it hopefully down there crossing the breech face. So there's the firing pin, after the fire restraint block is deactivated, which means everything is working as it should again. I'm going to take a pin punch on this pin, so that way when I'm hammering on down, I'm not going to come in contact with the frame. So those little filings are from the actual pin itself, because it is a pretty cheap little pin. I'll clean that out in just a second, but again, comes out to the other side. And even though I'm double checking all the functions, you know, you don't have to do that obviously, but it definitely gives me a peace of mind that everything is working right. Go ahead and reinstall the barrel bushing. The plug, the recoil spring and recoil guide rod. Made it to the frame. Line up the takedown lines. Check reset. Check all the functions of the pistol. And slide locks back. Trigger works. Reset works. All the tension springs are there. Everything seems to be working perfect. And that is the reassembly of the CZ97B. And again, all these parts are OEM. They were not modified. They went out just as they went in, just as they went out. So later on, I will go into the project of this firearm and work on some of the modifications, and we'll go over some of the similar reassembly and disassembly of the firearm. But thanks for watching again. Shoot straight, shoot safe, guys.